Good morning, friends. Um, I welcome you to this second lecture on Stuart Hall, in which we are going to look closely at his very important essay, Encoding, Decoding, that was published in 1973, and which may be considered to be a manifesto uh, for cultural studies. In many ways, this particular article set the trend for future research in the field of cultural studies as well as in the field of communication studies. So, the importance of this essay cannot be exaggerated. It has been one of the most talked about, one of the most cited uh, pieces of Stuart Hall, and it actually helped to alter the contours of the disciplines of cultural studies and communication studies. And we have already talked about Stuart Hall and his contribution to the field of cultural studies. In this essay and in this talk, we are going to look at the way in which Stuart Hall actually used the Marxist framework very profitably for the analysis of how um, messages work in the media, particularly in the television media. Now, I hope you remember the process of the model of commodity and money circulation in Marx and the kind of circuit that he draws of money, commodity, and money in turn again. I hope you remember that circuit. Hall applies the same kind of uh, theoretical framework. He applies the same circuit, the same model to build his own circuit of communication. And before we move further, it's also important for us to keep in mind two of the important, um, you know, uh, aspects of Marxist theory, which Hall particularly finds useful. One is the relationship between things that's dialectical in Marx instead of being a cause and effect relationship. So the relationship between the elements of a system is dialectical and not causal. This will become clearer once we uh, get into the an in-depth analysis of Hall's essay. Secondly, each element of a system, it's important to remember this Marxist um, belief as well before we move on to discuss Hall's essay, that each element of a system is connected to the other, but it can also retain its distinctiveness, right? Things are related within a system. The elements that constitute a system are related to each other, but they also happen to have sufficient independence or relative independence to work freely of each other. But that doesn't take away from the fact of their interdependence. Now, if you look at the conventional structure of the communication model, what we find is a linear kind of a model, which is very straightforward, very simplistic, and therefore very often quite misleading, actually. Now, the kind of scenario that we have in this kind of a linear representation of what happens in the process of communication is that there is a sender who sends a message, and the receiver is the recipient of that message. It's as if everything happens in a straight line from A to Z. There is a sender who sends a message, and it's received by uh, the recipient, and therefore the receiver is always expected to be a passive recipient of meaning, a passive recipient of messages. There's only one way in which messages can be interpreted, right? This is the understanding that we have from the traditional communication theory. The traditional model of communication believes in this linear model where a message is simply passed on by the sender to the recipient. Nothing happens in between, nothing happens at the end. It's just a direct process. But obviously, this model is seriously limiting because it fails to make sense of what actually happens in the process. It fails to understand that there are important changes that take place in each of these moments, starting from the time of the production of a message to its final, um, uh, the receiving of the message by the recipient. There's a whole process that it has to go through, and there are a lot of things that happen in between. This is what the traditional model of communication failed to explain, right? Suppose we blow up this model and we look at each of the things that happen here more closely. Then what will we get? Suppose we look at the process of production of meaning itself more closely, or the production of a message more closely. What would we see? Are we going to see the same thing that we see otherwise in the traditional model, or are we going to see something more? If we pay close attention to what happens in each step of the process of communication of a message, we will find that each moment is distinctive, but at the same time, each moment is also related to the other one. This was precisely the method that Marx used in The Capital and to explain the process of commodity production. And that is what Stuart Hall tries to do here. So this model is that he's trying to build here obviously is advantageous, is far more advantageous than the traditional model because um, it can explain how the same product appears differently at different stages of uh, you know passing from the sender to the receiver. The message does not remain the same. This is a fact. However much the traditional model of communication might try to convince us that it's a simple, you know, sort of relationship where one side is the donor and the other side is the receiver, the fact of the matter is communication never takes place this way. It's far more complicated than that. That complexity of the process of communication is accounted far better by this system, this method of Hall, this circuit that he is going to propose. And along with Hall, of course, another thinker who is important for Hall is, and apart from Marx, another thinker who is important for Hall is, of course, Rolla Barthes. And we can see why. Um, it will get probably clearer as we move along, but just to highlight this point here, you see, we have discussed the date of the author earlier, and we have seen that Rolabad had declared that the reader can only rise to prominence at the cost of the author. The author must be removed from the scene uh, for the reader to really be liberated and uh, for the reader to realize his true potential as a reader. Stuart Hall is trying to devise a model in which the receiver of the message, or let's say the reader, uh, is a, plays a far more active role than was hitherto expected of him. So this is where we see the contribution of Rollerbach. So the main argument of this essay that Stuart Hall has written is that we must be able to distinguish clearly between the encoding of media text by producers and the decoding by consumers. Okay, and this is not a straight way process. In fact, Hall argues that the audiences or the readers have the ability and the freedom to produce their own readings and meanings. That is, they have the freedom to decode text in in ways that are greatly different from the intended meaning of the producer of the message. So, thus, while traditional communication theory had considered the audience's role to be, you know, unimportant, Stuart Hall's model highlighted the active role of the reader or the audience. So Hall here proposes a four-stage theory of communication, which involves production, circulation, consumption, and uh, reproduction. Right. So these are the four stages of the Hall's model. What does production involve? Production is the encoding of a message, right? Where the creator of the message feeds off society's beliefs, society's ideologies, and society's prejudices. So that is the first stage. Remember, production involves the encoding of a message. And how is the message encoded? There are ways of doing it. You cannot do it in any way that you please. There are conventions of encoding a message, and that is very often in line with the beliefs, the dominant beliefs and values of a society at a given point in time. The second stage in Stuart Hall's model is that of circulation, the manner in which the message is circulated. How is a message circulated? In what form is it circulated? Right. This also plays an important part in the entire process of decoding and encoding. Depending on the form of circulation, the message itself will alter. There are certain things that can be said in a particular way in a particular medium which may not be common in another medium. The third stage in the process of encoding and decoding is use or consumption, which means the decoding of a message by active recipients. Remember, we have to repeat this again. The audience or the reader is not merely a passive uh, you know, recipient, but he is active. He is actively involved in the process of decoding the message. The final stage in the process of encoding and decoding is a reproduction, according to Hall, in which the reaction, which involves the reaction or the response of the audience after decoding the message. What happens subsequently after the message has been decoded? And decoded, for instance, in a way, uh, not always, but sometimes very differently from the way in which it is expected by the producer. So the aftermath of the process of decoding is um, what comes under reproduction. Now remember, to make the point that we were making earlier, each of these stages is relatively autonomous of the other. And yet they are also dependent on each other. So the process of production is relatively, to some extent, it has its own unique way of working, which is independent of the other three stages. But at the same time, production, the stage of production also is dependent on the other three stages. Um, Another thing to remember, and that's the beauty of Stuart Hall's model, is the fact that the possibilities for interpretation are limited by each stage. So, uh, what a particular message could mean is limited by uh, every stage, that has a bearing on the subsequent stage, and the meaning, the range of possibilities is limited by at every stage, for the subsequent stage. And at every stage, the message is, uh, processed in accordance with some established conventions. And what are these conventions? These conventions are very often discursive. What is possible to be said about a particular thing at a particular moment in a legitimate way. This is what um, constitutes a very important aspect of the model that's being proposed by Stuart Hall. Discourse is a very important aspect of this. You know, this exchange or this um, the communication takes place not in a vacuum, but it takes place in discourse. And if it takes place in discourse, we are aware of the fact that in discourses, in discursive formations, things can only be said in a particular way. There are ways of talking about uh, a thing. There are conventions, there are established conventions that one must follow. We are also aware of the fact that discourse is always shaped by the existing socioeconomic and linguistic power relation. Um, the production, circulation, and consumption of messages is therefore always reliant on the context of the socioeconomic power relation, right? So, what will be considered to be, say, for instance, legitimate knowledge, what can be said or what cannot be said about a particular thing at a given moment in history will be decided by the power relations that are at work. So you can see how he's also bringing in Foucault here. Encoding of a message takes place in a particular context at a determinate moment. Encoding takes place at a determinate moment. Decoding also takes place at a particular moment, at a specific moment in time. And um, by the time the message reaches the audience or the reader, it has been subjected to what Hall calls distortions, right? therefore, there's a lack of equivalence quite often between the encoding and what comes out finally at the end that of the process of decoding. And remember, both encoding and decoding involve interpretations. Um, there are actually three positions from which the audience or the reader might decode a message. Okay, Hall identifies, remember, three positions from which the audience or the reader might decode uh, a message. One is what he calls the dominant position. We'll explain this in just a while, but first let me uh, talk about, just mention the three kinds of positions, right? One is the dominant position, the other is the negotiated position, and the third is the oppositional position. And the names themselves are indicative of the kind of response or the kind of uh, subject position from which the audiences or the readers decode this text. What is the dominant or the hegemonic position? If the consumer or the reader decodes a message directly in sync with the uh, way in which it was encoded or the way in which it was meant by the producer of the message, then his reading or his interpretation is considered to be a dominant or a hegemonic position, right? If your interpretation is perfectly in sync with what is being said by the producer of the message, then your interpretation is dominant, hegemonic, dominant slash hegemonic. Secondly, some audiences may not entirely accept the message in the way it was intended by the producer, but he or she might negotiate with the, the meaning, and he might partially accept the intended message and partially reject it. In such a case, it's called a negotiated position, which is a mixture of acceptance and uh, rejection. The reader generally accepts the preferred meaning, but at the same time, he also modifies and rejects it to reflect his or her own experiences and interests. Please remember that these interpretations always happen. The interpretation of the reader always happens from a point of view which is informed by the reader's own background, the reader's own ideology, the reader's own standpoint, which of course is reflected by or affected by a host of factors. Finally, we come to the oppositional position, where the reader comes up with a completely different meaning from the intended one. See, feminists very often say, for instance, to give you an example, undertake this method of reading deliberately as a stance, oppositional or resistant reading, in order to read between the lines of patriarchal text or text which um, are in sort of reflexive of the patriarchal ideology, right? This is a handy way of reading a text where you are out to discover the true um, meaning of a text, and which is very different from what the author had intended, right? So when we talk about rereading a text very often today, say for instance, there's some text of literature that was written many years back, and so far it has been considered to be a perfectly innocent one, right? Which doesn't have any bias against women, which does not talk in favor of slavery, things like that. But now, uh, with the coming of feminist theory, with the coming of post-colonial theory, the reader is equipped with the tools that's required for an oppositional reading of such text. Now, just think about it. Where do you situate yourself as a reader? How do you respond to text? Say, how do you respond to films as the audience? Do you respond to it in terms of taking up an oppositional stance, or do you take up a negotiated stance, or do you think that you just take up the dominant or the hegemonic stance? So, do think about it yourself and think about it in terms of your own examples, and how you would respond to a particular, to having watched a particular movie and your response to it. And then think in terms of how your response to a movie changed after you read a critical review of that movie by someone else. Then you discovered that what you had thought about the movie earlier wasn't exactly um, uh, in sync with what this critic is saying now. So you go back to the movie, you watch it again, and see if you agree with him or not. So there are, this is something that we can all definitely try. And of course, um, as scholars of cultural studies, as students of cultural studies, we are supposed to develop this habit of oppositional reading. This should be one of the outcomes of our course, that we should not just be passive recipients of meaning, but be able to actively contribute to the production of meaning itself. So this is where you can see that for Stuart Hall, human agency is tremendously important, right? Agency, the question of agency is very important. Individuals do have the freedom of choice. Um, this is where I guess is different from the Frankfurt School of thinkers. Mm, it's not as if audiences merely accept, or the working class merely accepts whatever is imposed by the dominant order. They have their own strategies to cope with this, and the response sometimes, not sometimes, very often, is very different from what would be expected generally of them. So, you know, this question of human agency is extremely important for Stuart Hall, and we should also remember that we draw upon our prior knowledge of the world whenever we are interpreting a message. Whenever we are decoding a message, we always bring into bearing our previous knowledge of the world, right? So please keep these things in mind, and also remember the question of agency, which is so important for Stuart Hall. Thank you. Thank you so very much.